Thank you, Minister. Our feature presenter today. You know, in introducing, I had my thought process when I think about introducing our feature speaker. Most of us in Trinidad and Tobago, we talk, but this is a professional, a businessman, that when he does not agree with what's happening, is prepared to spend his money and go all the way to the court. And I'm happy to have him here as our feature speaker this morning. He's a valuation surveyor, a past president of the Institute of Surveyors of Trinidad and Tobago, of JCC, a businessman who have always contributed in one way or the other for what the Institute has done. And I expect he will continue to do so in the future. So join with me to welcome our feature presenter, none other than our own Mr. Afra Raymond.
Okay. Good morning, colleagues, particularly good morning to Minister Penelope Beckles. And of course, I see some colleagues I need to say hello to, special people. I see Grace Lafoure. Grace, good morning. And I have some things to say about the planning profession. And of course, our elder, we took a photograph together with him this morning, Mr. Ivan Lachlan. And Ivan is one of those people who was 81 about 2 months ago. Whenever I call him, I say, Ivan, how are you? And there's a long pause. And then he says, well, I'm not sure, but I'm still here. And Ivan, I'm continuing in that tradition. I'm still here. So let's start. This morning, the theme of the conference really, and there are themes that interlock, is about land policy within this particular juncture of society, and the whole question of planning. And I want to take some broader perspectives on that. And I will touch on planning. I will touch on procurement. It's not a procurement speech you're going to hear. I'm going to touch on it. And I am going to be making particular points about projects. And what we as a profession, because these questions to me are fundamentally questions of professional responsibility. What we as a profession, the profession of the land, what we as a profession can contribute to national development within these interlocking areas. I'm sorry that my erstwhile colleague, Dr. James Armstrong, is not here because he's the next speaker on the program. And James is, of course, a professional planner, urban and regional planner, very eminent. And interestingly enough, my qualification, when I qualified as a chartered surveyor back 30 years ago in 1993, my qualification, when I did something called the assessment of professional competence, which is the final test they give you, my qualification was in planning and development. That was the division I passed through to become a chartered surveyor. So planning and development was very much part of my training and development as a surveyor. It wasn't valuation. I was competent in valuations and I can do them, but I was trained in planning and development. So this is very much my meat and drink. Now, when we talk about planning, we are talking about the allocation of scarce resources to achieve a particular objective. And those scarce resources would include our time, our energy, our money, that we popularly call capital under capitalism, and our land. Our colleagues spoke about the land space of the country being 5,100 square kilometers, more or less, yeah? And we have to use that space prudently because a part of the space is allocated as natural reserves, a part of the space is forests, yeah? A part of the space is too mountainous for easy and ready development, too remote. And only a small part of the country is readily accessible, or what we use to use a kind of a tongue-tie word, developable. Okay, try it, developable. It's only a part of it is developable. Now, that's what planning means. Planning is about the allocation of scarce resources. But planning and development are often allied as companion phrases, and we now have to contemplate the meaning of development. Now that's a whole thing. We'll keep a conference for a week on that. What does development mean? We are talking about the development of society. I was really pleased with the minister when she spoke. She made the point, and she put things in a particular priority when she spoke about us developing the land and developing the country. But first of all, the people. She put things in a particular priority, and I'm grateful to that. Now I'm going to contest it, because in fact, if we're discussing ecological and environmental change, which is the underlying theme of the conference, in relation to planning and development, we have to really grapple with the question of the priority humans take within the whole ecology, which is the question the minister was advancing. So we can't just leave it there untested. We have to discuss it, okay? Now, we also have to deal philosophically, because these are philosophical questions. We have to deal philosophically. What do we mean by development? Is Port of Spain, as it now is, not according to the lawyers as it then was, is Port of Spain as it now is developed? Is Port of Spain developed more than it was 40 years ago? How are you measuring that? Because we are surveyors, and I'm returning all the time to the question of professional responsibility and what is our role as surveyors. Surveying is the science of measurement. That's what it is. From the times of Egypt, surveying is the science of measurement. We all measuring things. Mr. Derek Outridge, a quantity surveyor, and he's measuring certain things. Michael Sutherland and Cherise Griffith-Charles, they are land surveyors at Ivan. Geomatics, they are measuring other things. And people like myself from the valuation surveying fraternity, stroke planning and development, we are measuring other things again. And it's by understanding those different measurements and bringing it together, we can have a context to what is planning and development. So I ask the question again, not to be provocative, is Port of Spain developed as it now is? Anybody? We'll get to that in the discussion. Is it, somebody says no in the back there. A politician, no, sorry. I'm sorry. That was close. And I want to make the point, because we're going to have to exchange on these points. And I want to make the point about the philosophy of development. The philosophy of development, in my respectful view, is contained in the preamble to our 1976 Constitution. It's not, I am not saying so, because it's my personal opinion. Or I like this and I don't like that. And I voted this way and I didn't vote that way. The preamble of our 1976 Constitution says, for those of you who don't know, take a chance and read. Reading is not very popular nowadays, but you could learn a few things. Take a chance and read it. It speaks about the assets of the community, meaning the country, being used to subserve, which means to uphold and uplift and advance, these little arcane words that find their way, to subserve the common good. That's in the preamble of the Constitution. The preamble comes before everything else. And there's a reason it comes before, because it's more important. It sets a framework. So philosophically, as a country, we are setting up a platform where all of the assets of the country, and we go back to the assets that we are planning the disposition of, the capital, the land, the time, and the energy, ought to be put in place to subserve the common good. Is Port of Spain a developed city? See? Study it. Now, the Trinidad and Tobago Society of Planners, I know we have our colleagues here, the Trinidad and Tobago Society of Planners, via the Town and Country Planning Division, and of course we have the PFD, and the Urban and Regional Planning Act that is going to be proclaimed hopefully shortly. They have a role to play in all this. But I would return to the question of what role do we have to play as surveyors? And there's a sort of an interesting tension, and I'm going to go into it now. There's an interesting tension, sort of like an intention, between the Planning and Facilitation Development Bill Act, which in fact puts in place a framework, a modern, effective framework for land use planning and development, and the Public Procurement Act, which has been passed but not proclaimed. And the Public Procurement Act has two parts that interlock with the planning concerns. The first one is that the public authorities that are doing contracts are no longer allowed to have phantom projects. At the beginning of every year, the public authorities, they call procuring authorities, procuring agencies, are supposed to publish an annual procurement plan, which says what you are going to do, where those funds have come from, how many homes are you going to build? Yes? How many schools? Where are the schools? So you're replacing your Rima Boys RC? Well, you have to say so. You're replacing your Rima Boys RC. And it's going to cost 62 million and the money comes from the IADB, say so. So the annual procurement plan gives a structure and an intentionality to the activities of the procuring agencies. In addition to the annual procurement plan, there's also a requirement within the procurement cycle. We have something called the procurement cycle. It's like a diagram. You can look it up. They have them all over the world, the procurement cycle. And interestingly enough, the procurement cycle, the very first stage of it is the needs assessment. And the needs assessment asks the important questions, two important related questions. What are we trying to do with this project? And why are we trying to do it? So in the case of the little example I gave you, trying to replace the Arima Boys RC school. I just made up a school, okay? We're not really replacing the Arima Boys RC school. I don't want anybody to say that I said they were replacing the Arima Boys RC school. I'll make up something to make a little example here this morning with you all. And that was to see if you all were paying attention. But seriously, so we have the Arima Boys RC school to be replaced. That's what we're doing. Yeah? The next question is, why are we doing it? Is it that the cost of maintenance has become too high? Is it that the building has a low maintenance cost, but there's an environmental impact from some of the materials that were used? Is it that the children nowadays have different needs? And so on and so on. So one is required to interrogate, to use the intellectual language we hear at the university. One is required to interrogate the project itself thoroughly before you launch into publishing RFP and tender and assessing tenders, and that is where Outreach and these guys will come to the table and have their input and so on, okay? Part of that, in the case of a commercial project, would be to test the feasibility of the project. Because if the project is not feasible, it shouldn't happen. And why do I say that? Because basically, in the learning about public money, because this is partly part of this is about money, not all about land. The learning about public money tells us that in fact, public money needs to be treated to a higher standard of management and a higher standard of accountability than private money. That's what the learning teaches us, okay? That's Lord Sharman holding to account a 2001 report to the House of Lords in England. That is the authoritative statement internationally up to now, holding to account. But we don't do that here. So our profession has some responsibilities to discharge. And that came out, the fact that we don't do it here came out very obviously during the Off inquiry, which was held under the late Mr. Manning. Mr. Manning was Prime Minister. He set up a commission of inquiry under Professor Off that looked into the public sector construction industry. And it came out in that commission of inquiry. It never made it into the report. But that's okay. The report doesn't have to have everything. It can't have everything. It was millions of pages of testimony. But it emerged that projects aren't tested. There's no feasibility test. How did it emerge? Professor Off gave me an opportunity, to the objection of everyone else, to question Calder Hart, the great Calder Hart that was Mr. Manning's favorite public servant. And I was given 10 minutes to do it. So I asked Calder Hart, I said, out of all of these projects you all have built in Port of Spain, have you conducted feasibility tests on them? And he was someone who put himself about as a financial expert. He was a banker, home mortgage bank. That was his profile professionally. I said, have you conducted a feasibility test? He said, on one. Well, you know the amount of buildings they built in Port of Spain. So on one. I said, really, which one was that? International Waterfront Center. I said, okay. when you conducted the test, what was the break-even rent? And for colleagues who aren't familiar, let me pause and explain what the break-even rent is. The break-even rent is the amount of money the building has to rent for to pay back your bankers. So if you were borrowing money, so you're moving with the private sector assumptions, working from the sham and learning about public money being treated at a higher standard than private money, a private person approaching a project would have to buy land, engage a contractor, pay architects and designers, and pay a banker. And all of that is added up to a sum of money that has to be amortized over a period of time. Amortize is just a fancy word, meaning divide by the number of months and the amount of interest, okay? And that figure is the break-even rent. So I asked Hart, I said, so what was the break-even rent? He said about $20. Now I know he was lying because I had worked out the figures before. And the figure for the international waterfront is $35. So I said, really? So what figure did you apply to, what figure did you attach to the land? What value did you attach to the land? Because that site is the most valuable site in the whole city of Port of Spain. So I was very interested in his answer. His answer was nothing. I didn't put anything on the land. I said to Off, thank you very much. I'm finished with this witness. That is the foolishness we dealt with in this country. So the most well-equipped and the most high-performing public servant we had, according to Mr. Manning, was putting forward project after project after project with no feasibility test. None. And the one that he tested, the test was nonsense. Because how could you analyze a property project and omit the property? It literally makes no sense. Okay? I made my contribution. It didn't make its way into the report. It said the transcripts. Okay? That is what we're dealing with. And it's continuing up to now. So we have a situation where the practice, that procurement cycle hasn't been adopted. And needs to be adopted regularly. Not only for public sector schemes, because this is not a session where I'm going to stand here bashing politicians. I could say without fear of contradiction, that many private projects by people who should know better, the same nonsense is going on. I wrote about it in 2007. I believe it would have been about May of 2007 when RBTT put up their new headquarters at Sinclair Avenue. So we're not talking any politician, and this is not about Mr. Manning and Mr. Pandey and Mrs. Prasad Bissessa and Dr. Rowley. This is not about any politician. RBTT put up their headquarters on Sinclair Avenue opposite QRC. And I was able to demonstrate in that article, RBTT was mad. They were never able to send a lawyer's letter, despite all of the growling and the threats. I was able to demonstrate in that article that even RBTT, who are financial experts in the private sector, they had been taken for a ride by the people who build the building. Because the people who build the building is not RBTT. It's a company called Royal Court Limited. The shareholders of which is Mr. Joe Azar and Mr. Peter Julie, who was a former CEO of RBTT. He was the chairman of the bank at the time. Nice, eh? You understand it? Conflict of interest is not just a political thing, eh? Are you understanding it? RBTT itself has 20% shares in Royal Court Limited. And the rent that they were paying for that space, because of course the financiers have to get a pound of flesh. And in this case, the financiers weren't RBTT. The financiers were Mr. Azar and Mr. Julie. The rent that they were paying was way more than the market rent. So it's not just government I'm on here. It's a question about, as a society, how we allocate land, how we allocate capital, and how we allocate opportunities. It's very serious. That same Royal Court Limited, according to what I read in the papers, rented the space for the DPP, the one on Park Street. That was in the papers recently. $600,000 a month in July of 2020. 23,000 square feet. I know you have some bright ones in the audience. That's $26 a square foot. No building in Port of Spain has ever rented 23,000 square feet for $26 a square foot. If anybody bring it out and show me, I'll eat my hat. Particularly in that location. That is in the bottom end of Port of Spain in terms of where the market stands. And then turn around and spend $24 million to fix a building that you're paying top rent on. That is what we're fighting with. And that is the contribution surveyors are supposed to bring to this thing. It is more than a quantity surveying question of whether the $24 million that was spent was value for money. which is a real question, whether $24 million in steel and concrete was actually put into the correct place and so on, yes? There are real issues of value for money. And there are real issues of how we achieve development and how we plan for it. So there's a synergy, in my view, between the contribution this profession can make, the profession of the landed profession, and our colleagues in the planning profession, and of course, the minister who graced us with those very important points, okay? So we had a UDCOT chairman in 2009 under oath at a commission of inquiry explaining that out of all those buildings they built, only one had a feasibility test. And that feasibility test, as I've demonstrated, was nonsense. Okay. We have a current UDCOT chairman, as Mr. Garcia. They're putting up a new building by the Savannah, 3 basement floors of parking and 9 upper floors. I commented on it on Ash Wednesday. And I asked the question. I don't know the answer, but I'm asking the question. Was a feasibility test done? The same question I applied to Mr. Kohler-Hart. I'm not displaying any bias. I'm applying the same question to Mr. Garcia as I applied to Mr. Kohler-Hart. Was a feasibility test done for that building, yes or no? If a feasibility test was not done, why wasn't it done? Do we have so much money that we could just put up buildings without any need to test the feasibility? And if it was done, what is the break-even rent? Because Mr. Garcia in the newspaper article was making remarks to the point that they were building more square feet than they needed because he was going to rent out some of the space, UDCOT, and make back money to help with the costs and so on. Now that doesn't make any sense. The break-even rent for that building is over $30. And the best rent in Port of Spain now is $20. That is the thing we're grappling with. And until we become economically and financially literate, to vote for the minister's statement, you're speaking about technically literate. We have to become economically and financially literate and know about applicability. Apply that literacy to our area of expertise, which is land and buildings, yes, and property investment. Then we can make a contribution to national development that is worthy of an institute of surveyors, okay? We also have a case, in case anybody may want to accuse me of railing against one particular administration. We also have the case of Uwe Debe, my good friend. In the same building, we were here a few weeks ago when Rosemary Bellantwine, Professor Bellantwine, was inaugurated as the principal of UWI. And we had a lovely ceremony over at Daga Hall. And we were here having drinks and so on. And now I see Professor Bellantwine grappling with the thorny issue of what to do with Uwe Debe. When Uwe Debe was being proposed in 2012, we went and we had meetings with Professor Sankar. I led the delegation to try to talk to him about why was he doing this project, what was his sense of it. Another administration was in power, so this is me speaking about the other side, let's put it that way. And he couldn't explain. And we ended up going ahead with that project to the tune of 700 to 800 million TT dollars with China Jiangsu. The same company that the thing fell down in Mova, Las Alturas, China Jiangsu. Same people. All of those were our objections. And at the time, what Professor Sankar was trying to tell us was that the building was being put up to open a law faculty in Debe. That was the thing that was being pushed. We discovered about a week after that meeting that none of the lawyers in the law faculty here had ever been consulted. So consultation is not just a political plaything, it's a real thing, okay? It then changed because the building eventually finished. It took a long time, it took more money, it had problems. We knew all that was going to happen, it finished. And then they started talking about something about a faculty for the arts. And the people in there weren't interested either. And now I see my friend Rosemary Bellantwine, Professor Bellantwine, the principal, grappling now with the notion of trying to use that to open another medical school, kind of like have medical students coming to study and so on. And all of this, the fact that we've had a building, 10 years ago, we started building it. It finished about 5 years ago. It's a huge complex for those of you who don't know it, who don't know South. It's a huge complex, modern thing, all kind of thing. It's never been used. But at the same time, we have problems with supplies in the hospital and sometimes in the schools, yeah, and the bad roads and the water pipes that are rusty. And it's a question of attaching priorities and planning if we want to achieve development. So those are some of the contributions we could bring to bear as colleagues on these burning questions. I'm going to pause there. I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a good rest of the conference. I'm looking forward to Sharice and Michael's presentation later. So thank you, colleagues.